ladies and gentlemen. As the Senior Program Manager of the South Asia Regional Office of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, it is my honor to welcome you to participate in an online event titled Ukraine Crisis, Assessing South Asia Responses. Friedrich-Naumann Foundation is a German political foundation that promotes liberal values, working in the areas of good governance, rule of law, education, and freedom market economy. We achieve our goals by political consultancy, political dialogue, and civic education. FNF South Asia facilitates dialogues on current issues for German audience to inform them about different perspectives within South Asia countries. We do it via webinars like the one we are conducting today, or by organizing offline events. As Russia invades Ukraine, South Asian countries has responded distinctively to this crisis. The ongoing invasion has wide-reaching economic, geopolitical, and strategic implications for South Asia. We organized a webinar on the same topic last month, wherein we invited resource persons from India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka to give their perspectives. We continue with this series, and this time we have invited resource persons from Nepal, Bhutan, and Maldives to share their respective perspectives. I'm thankful to our resource persons today to be part of this forum. The session could cover the implications for countries and the broader implications of the war in the wider Indo-Pacific region. Before I hand over the proceedings to our moderator, we would like to relay a message from Dr. Markus Faber, the Member of Parliament in Germany. Dr. Faber is a member of the Bundestag from the state of Saxony-Anhalt since 2017. He did his basic military service in Heidelberg and studied political science in Potsdam and Sydney. He's the member of the Defense Committee in the Bundestag and is the FDP parliamentary group spokesperson on defense policy. Dr. Faber couldn't be present live today as presently German parliamentarians are busy with the budget talks after the formation of new government last year. So we have a recorded message from him.
Warm welcome everybody. My name is Markus Faber from the German Bundestag. I'm a member of the Defense Committee, so very attached to the issue we're talking about today. And I just wanted to say thank you to the Naumann Foundation for inviting me to give you this address. I'm very sorry that I cannot take part live, but we actually have a budget discussion right now in the parliamentary hall, so I have to be present there. We have seen a lot in the last months. We have seen a brutal attack on the sovereign and democratic state from the dictatorship just next door, and we have seen a massive amount of war crimes that continue to shock us and I think the rest of the world. We should do everything to stop Russia and to support the democracy that is under attack here, because the result of this conflict will also affect the rest of the world. If a dictatorship is successful in an attack on a democracy, this can also have an influence on other dictatorships that are willing to address other democracies, such as in Asia as well. So let me briefly tell you how the situation unfolded after 2014. In 2014, we have seen Russia attack Ukraine, occupy Crimea, and also continue war in eastern Ukraine, on Donbass, on Donetsk, on Luhansk. We have seen this for 8 years. And Ukraine, I think in 2014, thought that this is a good idea to stop the fighting about Crimea to prevent peace. And I think by now they know this was a mistake. So right now Ukraine says, okay, we have to come to a peace that is endurable, that will stay for a long time. So the Ukraine is willing to fight for their homeland. They are willing to attack the Russians, to strike back. And I think the Ukraine really made a turn in the last 8 years, so that nowadays there's hardly any Ukrainian that is friendly to Russia after the Russians attacked the country just next door, as we have also seen the same thing in Georgia happening before. So in 2021, in the end of 2021, more than 180,000 Russian troops are concentrated around Ukraine for exercises. But you normally don't do exercises with thousands of liters of blood conserves, blood reserves. So we have seen diplomatic issues in the beginning of 2022 that were unfortunately not successful because the dictator in the Kremlin was not willing to give it any chance. He was willing to take. So the Western countries, but I think every free country in the world also has to be willing to defend the Ukrainians and to help them defend themselves. So we in Germany, what we have done is called Zeitenwende. We have actually changed our view on Russia, our view on security. We have actually supported the Ukrainians. We delivered Stinger rockets, we delivered Panzerfaust, and we will also deliver heavy weapons. And we have also prolonged sanctions on Russia, so that Russia will hopefully not be able to start such kind of warfare anymore. Russia has violated a lot of international laws, also to mention the Budapest Memorandum, where the Ukraine has voluntarily given up its nuclear weapons. So in return, Russia accepted the Ukrainian borders, and by now it is very hard, I think, for the Ukrainians to believe in any Russian guarantees, so they are willing to fight it out. They are willing to fight it out because Russia has lied once, Russia has lied twice, and it is very hard to believe Russia not to lie for a third time. So what we will do now, we will support Ukrainians. We will do what we call Ringtausch, so we will give German weapon systems also to Eastern European countries, so that the Eastern European countries can give their Soviet-made weapons to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are used to this, so they can use it much more easily. And we will also do economic issues. We will also tackle on economic issues. We will reduce our dependency on Russian oil. We have also already reduced it massively, and we will also do the same thing if it comes to Russian gas imports, for instance. I think this is a time where countries have to work together, and I'm hopeful that countries in Asia, in all parts of Asia, are willing to help the international order to prevail in this conflict and to find a way out of this armed conflict. So Russia will see itself not in victory, but we will see the victory of the rule of law. I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a very good discussion. Bye.
Now I have the pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, Mr. Pramit Pal Chaudhary. Pramit is a senior columnist with the Hindustan Times and distinguished fellow of the Ananta Aspen Center. He served on the Prime Minister's National Security Advisory Board from 2011 to 2015 and is an advisor to the Rhodium Group New York, Bower Group Asia, Washington, DC, and Mitsubishi India. As a member of Aspen Strategic Group of India, he is a member of Track 2 Strategic Dialogues between India and the US, Japan, Israel, and South Korea. Thanks, Pramit, for agreeing to be part of this webinar. Over to you.
Thank you, Nupur. Let me begin by mentioning that we will have three panelists: Gopilal Acharya from Bhutan, Major General Basniat from Nepal, and Dr. Abdul Hanan from the Maldives. And they will represent in many ways countries that are traditionally, I would say, not in the spotlight in the international system, but they've all represent countries that have expressed positions, and strong positions sometimes, regarding the war in the Ukraine. And so this is really ultimately about how these countries, how these individuals from these countries see a conflict in which a much larger country has invaded a smaller one. And as others have mentioned, the international system has had to react in different ways. I'm from India, obviously, and I'm sure many of you will know that India has already had to face some degree of pressure regarding its own position, and I'll be happy to answer any questions about India's point of view. But for the purposes of this panel, I'm going to focus right now on these other three countries, and I'll begin by asking each of them going through each of them a simple question about what was your country's response, your country's official response to the outbreak in the Ukraine war, and what were the motivations regarding that decision. So let me begin. I'll begin with alphabetically, so I'll go with Gopilal first, then to General Basniat, and then to Dr. Hanan. So Gopilal, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary, for moderating this session, and also thanks to FNF for having us here to discuss this very important issue. I think an issue that is already having a global impact. The repercussions, of the war are being felt all across the world today. And obviously, I think most of us, as at least for me as a journalist, we were following, the developments even before the war. We are following the telltale signs that were coming out from Russia, Moscow, and obviously the Western intelligence. So when the invasion finally took place, I should say that it wasn't a major surprise to anyone who have been closely watching the developments in the region. It was expected, as our keynote speaker mentioned. Russia's expansionist ambitions had been becoming very clear right from after its annexation of Crimea, and I guess its ambitions to expand its landmass beyond its internationally agreed borders. I think war becoming obvious. So I would say even to us here in Bhutan, the war, the invasion, the aggression, Russian aggression was of no surprise. What surprised us was that actually, the way it happened. And also, what surprised us was that superpower like Russia could actually, take advantage of its smaller neighbor. Democracy. Ukraine is also a flageling, democracy. I should say they've had, a rough ride over the many years. But then, Ukraine was embracing, democratic values. And I think as a sovereign nation state, an aggression by another big neighbor was totally I think unacceptable to the international community, including Bhutan. That's why Bhutan's standpoint was very clear at the emergency special session of the UN General Assembly on 2nd March. Bhutan's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ms. Domasering, made it very clear Bhutan's stand. And our stand was that we were against Russia, invading Ukraine.
So just one question, follow up on that. Was that a consensus position in the political, among all the political parties in Bhutan? I mean, did both parties support this position?
Right. Well, no political parties in Bhutan actually, expressed their, party-based opinions, took any party-based stand on this issue. But I would say what our UN, what our representative in New York, spelled out was kind of a common voice from Bhutan. So it was the national standpoint, irrespective of what individual political parties thought about it.
Thank you.
I think, Pamit, I think, what happened was the country stood united, the country united in its opinion of how, it saw Russia's invasion as totally illegitimate and, as totally irresponsible, as well as, disrespect to the international rules-based order that I think, all the United Nations member states have agreed in the Charter.
So General Basniat, I'll turn to you. Nepal had a position, at least at the UN, very similar to that of Bhutan. What do you think motivated that? And would that be a consensus position among Nepal's political parties?
Okay. One thing we have to look into when we look into South Asia, and while the bigger nations or stable economies have one side, the smaller states have taken the other side. I mean, actually opposing the aggression that Russia took. So apparently it was the precedence to the national interests, particularly on the developments that has been happening in Nepal and about the border issues and the geographical settings. It's an apprehensions position at the core of our disputations, like between China and India. So, I mean, this also reflects the set in the minds about reflecting the annexations of Tibet and Sikkim. So, like when Nepal, was upholding the United Nations Charter, and the rights and independence of smaller states is primarily supposing to countenance alike encounters in the regions with the, reinitiates of the applications of maybe sphere of influence in South Asia. The other would be a dependence of geoeconomics for security and scenarios for neutrality. And the other thing that how do you really develop trust on the bigger nations? And smaller economies like Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, I think were susceptible to the peripheral dynamics, and that could perceive short-term growth inconsistencies than larger states like Bangladesh and India.
Was there Nepal does have a multiple set of political parties? Was this essentially universal position, or as in the case of Bhutan, they were quiet about it?
All right. In this regards, just not Nepal, South. China has been having a lot, influence in South Asian countries, and Nepal has in the last 1 year. Nepal has a united feeling, and the passing of the border of the Kalapani being part of Nepal has been united. So anything issues regarding the national interests and national operations do have a united feelings in the parliament. So, and this seems to be quite a serious thing in the population, because nationalism plays a greater role. So, but bringing about what nationalism is a different part of political parties. But in this regards, if you look at Europe, if you think of it as our scenario that has been common into the 1930s or late 1930s, will the same scenarios of 1970s come in South Asia? Maybe a gentle also.
But then took an increasingly more critical stance regarding what was happening in the Ukraine against Russia. Perhaps you'd like to explain why that shift happened in your view, and how does the Maldivian political system as a whole, how have they reacted to this? Dr. Hanan, you're on mute.
Thank you, Praveen. Thank you, FNF, for having me in this important analysis of the Russian aggression towards Ukraine. As you know, you are already aware of the Maldivian standing in UN, and that might give a clue of the general. First of all, we should remind that Maldives, as you said, in the meeting, General Assembly meeting held on 3rd March of this year to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Maldives actually supported that resolution along 141 other countries. So that is the General Assembly, as we know. So Maldives, in this very important meeting, stood with the majority in condemning the Russian invasion. I think that is important to mention. And also the remarks made by the ambassador of the Maldives in the United Nations. Notably, she said that Maldives has always been always taken a principled stand against violation of the territorial integrity of sovereign nations. So this was, as we know, an unprovoked aggression by the Russia towards Ukraine, in invading Ukraine. So we are aware that since long Russia has been saying they will not invade and they will not start a war, and still they insist in their not waging a war and actually doing a special military operation. So Maldives clearly said that they will not, though we are a small country, they will not support this kind of aggression of violation of sovereignty. So this was the official stand. I think Maldives took this stand because the political elite in the Maldives, the government, understands very well that even to be neutral in this case is actually is regarded as a support of this invasion. Many regard that to be neutral also and abstain also as a support of this aggression invasion. So Maldives clearly supported this condemnation of Ukrainian invasion. So as you know, Maldives, even if it is a small state, it is trying to balance the relationships between different countries. Though we know that traditionally two main parties differ in some of the international stances, like the current government of MDP is somehow sway towards India, or you say more like a democratic Western system. And the current opposition party, which is the PPM, PPM has always traditionally been more towards China. And as we know, China is not a democratic nation, and Russia is always been with China. Even in this invasion, China and Russia seem to be supporting and helping each other. I mean, China, we know, are supporting Russia. If someone is staying in China and watching Chinese television channels, mostly state-controlled, I think the impression people will get in China is there is widespread support of this, whatever Russia is doing in Ukraine. So though we know that the two parties in the Maldives, they have this support either towards Western and Indian and democratic system, and the other party towards more like China. Though we never heard of the opposition party expressing their opinion of this invasion by Russia.
Let me see. Gopilal Acharya, are you still with us? We may have lost him. General Basniat is also off my screen. Perhaps they're having some...
Yeah, I'm here. I'm listening. Yeah.
Okay, great. So one of the questions, I mean, you raised, and I think a very pertinent issue, that for a lot of countries like Nepal and small countries that are, if you wish, watching what happens when they can get caught between great power rivalries. How much, let's put it this way, how much in the public sphere, whether it's in the media, among public intellectuals and so on, how much is that, or what are the other issues that the public are talking about in regards to the consequences of the war or what it means for their country?
Well, I mean, regarding the consequences, I mean, the inflation has risen so much. I mean, the fuel has almost gone, I mean, 2/3 up now. And regarding the security of food, it's all right. But I mean, though, I mean, the country as a whole is, I mean, facing problems, and the population as such has not yet, because one of the reasons is because of the local elections that just took place a week ago, and the rise of prices has not really taken into the diaspora. So I would think that, but when it comes to issues of bigger nations, like, I mean, and as I brought out earlier, I mean, the countries, I mean, Nepal, when I wrote a piece last time, I thought Nepal has to be a player and a playing ground. So I think this applies to most of the nations in South Asia, smaller nations. So I mean, I think that so this is a very sensitive issue about how people perceive in the country. So so I mean, but as far as the impact goes in like in South Asia, or I mean, there are three factors leading to. One is the resentment, it's the sensitivities of the Nepalese that has been treated unfairly by the bigger nations. And the other thing is, secondly, the apprehension. It's suspicions that the South Asian situations will revert to the original environment like in the 1970s. So, I mean, and the third would be the argument of the situations. Will the situations come to the borders of ours? So comparatively, I mean, the systems are not in place like in the EU and the NATO in Europe, and because the regional organizations in our region, the SAARC is dying, BIMSTEC is, I mean, attempting to strive. But bigger powers like India have her own strategic concerns with their priorities with the bigger nations. So you can see, though things do come up on the first neighborhood policies, but I mean, it is not really well taken. And third would be like the European borders are separate, unlike the South Asian borders. So and the other thing like would be like for bigger nations, like Russians would play. I mean, they have a veto in the Security Council, so that would also have some part in the bigger nations' positions or stand in comparison to the smaller nations.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, but isn't, let's say, Nepal a country which has, and you represent it yourself, a strong military tradition? Would Nepal also be slightly reassured to see how well small countries are in resisting larger countries' invasions. After all, you've seen Afghanistan push out the Americans. You've now seen Ukraine, if you wish, bloody the nose of Russia, and our country. The army is, if I remember correctly, 15 times larger than theirs.
There is a realization that Nepal is but at the same time there is another part of the thing that Nepal is an important place in the when the Indo-Pacific is playing the center role in the center role in the coming decade. So so naturally, like when you talk about the impacts of what the crisis is conducting is one would be, the pace of development. The pace of development that had a routine and a way of economies rise have been hit. That has been hit quite well. Like as per the UNDP report said, it said that the negative impact of the war in Ukraine in the fiscal year 2022-2023, and growth was expected to be moderate. So growth will begin to taper off in the second half of 2022. So now, as far as the South Asia economic focus is concerned, the growth rate was like, when you talk about the whole region, it was
completely correct. That the whatever the military condition or the military successes of the smaller countries, the economic devastation is always considerable. So back to Gopilal is back with us. So the same question really to you. Do you have how is the public, the media, what are the lessons they are taking and the consequences they are feeling or commenting on from the war? I think you're muted.
For Bhutan too, as a small, very, very small, in fact, country between the two giants with hardly any military capability, I think what we see, happening in Ukraine is, of course, a big lesson to us about the vulnerabilities of small nation states, especially if you are in the immediate neighborhoods of, rising superpowers of Asia, India and China. And for us too, there are geostrategic issues. Bhutan has been trying to assert, its coming of age as a sovereign nation state in the last, 30, 40 years at international forums. And we are, as a country, we have realized that for us, it is important that we are visible, and that, we have realized that we will never have the economic as well as military power that, our neighbors have. For us, therefore, to work out a different strategy of, this different strategy that suits our own interest, both strategically within South Asia as well as our, as well as reaching out our voice to a broader international audience. I think it's very clear now. So we have been developing, gross national happiness as a sort of soft power tool that will project Bhutan as a kind of thought leader despite its small size. But, the main lesson that we talk about in Bhutan obviously is, vulnerability of small states, and because nothing seems to be sure. You have an assurance today, but that assurance is, thrown out the window tomorrow, you see. So you do not know how these big nations, act. And first, I think for now, if you look at, we do not have, relations with all, big five, the Security Council members. Our major relationship is with India. We hardly have any trade relations with Russia, except for a little, small segment of tourism. Same with Ukraine. So our impact would be from our relationship with India. At this time, we broke ranks with India when we voted against, against the war. India, of course, abstained. So for us, it becomes important because on a daily basis, we deal with India, in our bilateral ties. India is our biggest trading partner. And if there's an impact in India because of the war, which we are already seeing in terms of fuel shortages, that is going to have a major impact on us as well. But as long as India takes care of, certain issues tactfully, I think Bhutan should not, have any kind of direct, worry about direct impact from what's happening in Ukraine. So that's, how we feel.
So, Dr. Hanan, let me turn to you and ask basically the same question. What are the lessons the general public have taken from what has happened in the Ukraine? And what are the consequences on the ground among people in Maldives?
I think, as our other speakers said, we are a small country. Actually, we are the smallest country in this region. But our public perception and opinion about this invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there are mixed sentiments, I think. And you can argue that these opinions are twofold. In one hand, there is a strong relationship between Maldives and both Ukraine and Russia, in the sense that, as our major economic activity and our main industry is tourism, is well known right now across the globe. In this year, Russia has been the #1 tourist arrival country to the Maldives with 15.5%. But I think that arrival number is mostly up to 24th February, up until the invasion. So I would assume that as we progress towards the end of the year, this percentage will decrease, because naturally Russian arrival must have been very much, decreased, almost. And similarly, the percentage of Ukrainians arrivals to the Maldives is also not few, 2.3%. And at the time of the invasion, there in the Maldives, there were 8,000 Russians at that time, and 750 Ukrainians. So this is an indication of the relationship we have between these countries. Though this is not a political connection, this is an economic connection. So I think on one hand, some opinion of those people involved in the tourism industry in different capacities, their opinion will be based on this contribution of many thousands of Russians to the economy, and also thousands of Ukrainians. So they would say Russia is a friendly country to the Maldives. They arrive in the country, but this is not a government supported government policy, but this is obviously Russian government has been supporting this economic activity anyway, because given the autocratic nature of the country, Russia. So some of the people, they are saying Russia is not after all a bad country because we have so many arrivals from Russia. But these are common Russians. These are not political people. These are common Russians. They're coming to enjoy the beauty of the Maldives. They have nothing to do with the policies of Putin. But many people, they do not understand this. On the other hand, there is a public view of Russia based on the propaganda of Russia Today TV still aired in the country. So you would assume that if someone is closely watching this TV channel every day, how much the opinion of that person will be spoiled by this, conspiracy theories and lies of Russian state media. So this is also there. If you read the comments of Maldivian people in social media like Facebook and even to the articles in daily newspapers like Mihar, you would see most of the people, they are critical of West in general, critical and support and admiration of Putin because he is standing up against West. This is the opinion and view of many people. But unfortunately, this opinion is based on lies and conspiracy theories. That's how I take it. And people like me who are academic and analyze situations do not support this invasion.
So just out of curiosity, I know that we have India also several thousand Russian tourists were stranded in India, as well as even more, I believe, in Sri Lanka when the war broke out. But because of Western sanctions, many of them, especially in Sri Lanka, definitely, their credit cards stopped working. And as a consequence, they were stranded without money and had to be actually supported they had to be fed by the Indian government, both here and in Sri Lanka. Do you have a similar situation in the Maldives?
Yeah. We have similar situation. Actually, at the time of the invasion, there were a number of Maldivian students stranded in all these countries, including Russia, Belarus, as well as Ukraine. I guess in Ukraine, there were more than 50 students stranded in various parts of Ukraine, including Kharkiv. And more than that number in Belarus and Russia also. All these people were definitely impacted with the economic sanctions. And we have heard stories of many parents worried about their children stranded in these countries. And timely, Maldivian government intervened, and actually, I think mostly through the Maldivian embassy in Germany, they lent their support and supported these students in all these three countries. Yes.
So before I turn back to the panelists, I'll just remind the audience that there is a chat function at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, it'll open it up and allow you to type in any questions that you may have for us. And some of you will notice some questions have already arrived. I'll also just quickly read out for the audience as to what the positions taken by the different South Asian countries at the United Nations General Assembly over the Ukraine war. Afghanistan took a neutral policy, but voted in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution, partly though because the neutral position was taken in the government in Kabul, which is the Taliban regime, but the vote in the UN General Assembly was taken by the Islamic Republic, which is the government in exile. And so in effect, Afghanistan had two different positions because it has officially two governments. Bangladesh at the policy level was unofficially neutral, but at the UN it abstained. Bhutan criticized Russia and voted in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution, as did Nepal. Maldives took a neutral policy, became slowly more critical of Russia, but voted in favor of the United Nations General Assembly resolution. Sri Lanka was neutral and abstained at the General Assembly. The same position, of course, that India took. India did release a point of view where they pointedly said that they supported the sovereign integrity of countries without necessarily specifying the Ukraine. So let me go back and let me just say that Dr. Hanan raised an interesting issue, which is that now in an age of social media, countries like Russia, even countries like Ukraine now, are extraordinarily good at being able to use social media to propagate a point of view and give a certain perspective on the conflict. Ukraine, for example, has actually been quite impressive, I would argue, in the way that it has been able to portray itself in the war, the number of videos it has laid out, the way it has had its soldiers be interviewed. And it's actually remarkable. It's often forgotten to a lot of people that the Ukrainian tech industry is actually relatively well developed. And there are a lot of very good Ukrainian technology people. For example, WhatsApp, which I think all of us use and is very widespread in South Asia. One of the inventors was a Ukrainian. So anyway, let me turn to Gopilal and ask him, has that been an issue? Has the social media battle between Russia, the West, Ukraine, even to some degree, like China perhaps, has that been an issue in Bhutan?
Not really, but you get to see perspectives. The good thing about social media is that you see a lot of alternative perspectives. Obviously, you have to be a little conscious while consuming what appears on social media. But those who are media literate and who can actually have some discretionary ability would agree that all these countries, especially like you said, Ukraine has very effectively used social media to reach out to the wider world, both in terms of positioning itself as as a victim of an unnecessary invasion, as well as in terms of seeking humanitarian and military assistance. So you see, President Zelensky, I think himself a very savvy social media user. I think has made a huge difference with his appearances on social media. And also, like you said, the access that the Ukraine has given to its soldiers, to its people, to its various, wings, to populate the social media with as much, information as possible. So, and of course, on the other hand, you have Russia that also does the same. But what is obvious, from the use of social media this time is that a war cannot be an isolated event anymore. With the technology coming in, I think the war is fought on everybody's smartphones now. So that kind of, galvanizes nations, galvanizes people, galvanizes opinions, and I think which is good. And what was obvious from my personal perspective was that with all the the social media coverage in the social media as well as the mainstream media, what was very apparent was the inaction of its so-called Western allies for a very long time. The support came very late when a lot of damage was already done, when a lot of people lost their lives, when a lot of people had to, had become refugees. So, it kind of made us realize that promises can still be empty, even from your so-called trusted allies, and it takes time for people to, for the nations to agree, for nations to come together and I think, make a decision a collective decision. But what was heartwarming was the trip that was made by the presidents of the Czech Republic, Poland, in the beginning. I think that was something we didn't expect. We thought maybe Boris Johnson or Joe Biden might come there first, but it was totally unexpected leaders who took risk of visiting Kyiv. So there was something that social media told us that do not always trust what comes out, as obvious. So I think it's kind of a very interesting, eye-opening, work that social media did this time.
So, General, you're a professional army soldier. Do you see that? Is the future of war now going to be about smartphones?
It is actually, but it so happened that Nepal was going into election phase. So most of this social media that was, practically covered by more on what the political parties were aspiring for and how, and more. It was basically focused on more elections rather than what actually was happening in Europe. Though, once the aggression happened, there was a very negative feeling that the social media created on the Russian aggression. So, the impressions that Russia had, I think, diminished quite a bit. And as I told earlier, Nepal being a small country in between China and India is very sensitive about its borders, very sensitive about things that happen. So, when we talk about social media, as soon as there are things that happen within, in and around the borders, and it goes, it takes quite a important stride forward. So, yes, social media does play an important role, but as far as the Russian invasion is concerned, it hasn't taken so much of a stride. Probably it may start because the results of the local elections have started coming in, so it might slowly take up now.
Is there a case, and I'll start with Dr. Hanan on this. Is there a case for a common South Asia position in these type of crises? And if so, should those positions be in a specific theater or a specific area, or particularly should it be about the broader issue of the war, or there should be specific areas where these countries can cooperate together?
I think it's a difficult question. We are sure that those who are participating in this session, those countries we represent, Maldives, Nepal, and Bhutan, we have common stand, I think. But when we look at other countries, especially bigger countries, like the biggest country is India, the second biggest is Pakistan, not in the list, but they are South Asian countries, and Bangladesh. These are the three biggest countries. They actually sort of supported this war by Russia. They didn't object the resolution to against this invasion by UN General Assembly. So when we look at the relationship between these countries and Russia and Ukraine, we see like between India and Russia, there's a strong, long-time military type of relationship since many years. So it's sort of very difficult for India to get out of that relationship between Russia. So it's very different. And ironically, the competitor of India, Pakistan, who fought more than one war against each other, they are sort of taking the same stand in this. So that is sort of ironical, because Pakistan is sort of, didn't object Russian invasion. And also the former Prime Minister, Imran Khan, his crying supporting slogan is also that because he visited Russia at the same day they invaded Ukraine, that was the reason that America decided to support his ouster from the premiership. So we know India and Pakistan in this case are thinking the same way. Though they are at loggerheads at each other, which is very ironic. But we small countries, we are not supporting this aggression. So when we look at the interests of these countries, then the interests are very different. The interests of India and Pakistan in this situation is very different. They have military connections with Russia. And for countries like Maldives, we have economic connections. And also, as a moral obligation, our countries fortunately took the stand of the majority in the General Assembly. But because of these strong links of India and Pakistan and probably Bangladesh as well with Russia, they didn't do that. So that is an observation.
That's actually a very good observation by Dr. Hanan, that the three largest South Asian countries all opted to abstain at the UN General Assembly about the UN General Assembly resolution, while the smaller countries took the more principled position to object and vote against the invasion. That raises an interesting question. Are the interests versus principles argument, if you wish, that the larger your country is, the more interests you have and the more willing you are to sacrifice principles to preserve them, possibly. But I'll just quickly, before we turn to the questions, and I just remind everybody that you can send us questions via the chat if you are on Zoom. And if you post questions on Facebook, they will be sent to us. So I'll turn to you, Gopilal, and ask you. Dr. Hanan's made a great point of view, great point. Small countries went on principles, big countries went on interests. Do you see it that way? You're on mute. Hi, Gopal, we can't hear you. Just check, is your Wi-Fi giving you problems again? Gopal, if you hear me, I will come back to you. I will turn to the general and ask him the same question. So, General.
Yes, I think the bigger nations in South Asia went more for interests. Yeah, but when you talk about the smaller nations, particularly the three nations that went against the resolution, I went for the resolution, is I think it's both the principles and interests. So it's, I think it goes both together. Like when you look at South Asia, if you look at the left corner and the right corner, and you have like the Taliban on the eastern and the Myanmar in the west, and don't follow any, and you don't see any oppositions by the bigger states in South Asia opposing to the dictatorship in Myanmar and the Taliban, prompting, that should prompt to go for a more democratic environment. So, like when you look at the Ukraine crisis, I think what we must understand is how will the war end and how will it impact the South Asia. So, the termination of the war actually. So, if I just take that turn, so that I think we're almost coming to the end of the time also, and it has 8 folds actually. It will be like authenticate the reforms of the United Nations, the provisions of the veto, that has already been tabled. And the second would be either, it will reshape the international global landscape from the Western of the United States dominations, or diplomatically and economically, celebrate to Russia. And the third would be the geostrategic interest of the United Nations and the European nations for a revised security apparatus like both NATO and the EU. And because 80% of the NATO countries is outside Europe. So fourth would be like Russia standing as the imminent European power, political and economic, polarizing Europe, or destabilized Russia with exhausted military capabilities and isolated from economic upholdings. And the other would be like a vigorous diplomatic endeavors that is taking place during the war now and post-war. For naturally the big powers, geostrategic advantages. And the other would be like, it's be a substitutes to a dependency on like energy that we are also the South Asians getting, or food security, and an alternative to what the global supply chain would like, and the humanitarian law that we heard at the beginning as well. So I think there is a great interest on seeing Ukraine as a sovereign state back in, so that the European nations do. And finally, there needs to be a comprehensive peace deal, and there may be a United Nations presence also. So when you look at South Asia in a broader aspect, I think economy is one, and headlines, and defense is another that is being greatly impacted, particularly for India, which upholds quite an amount of defense equipment from Russia, and the impact of sanctions, and is impacting the military capabilities of India as well. And the other third would be politically, like you brought out about these principles and the interests-based thing. And the fourth would be the lack of trust that the countries, smaller nations like us, and other nations with strategic importance having on big powers of their stand. So so this comes to to a point that we take as an opportunity, or the bigger nations use their initiative as an opportunity. Like, why do we not act together as South Asians? Or like, we have this, regional apparatus like the SAARC and the BIMSTEC. So this should be a platform of how we can address the mounting commodity prices and supply upholdings that we should do, and susceptible, and even addressing like the smaller nations' desires that security of supply, security of energy for smaller nations like Nepal and Bhutan, or landlocked countries. So this is what I see. So what I would like to suggest is, this is an opportunity for bigger nations in South Asia and the bigger powers to actually get the regional associations to get common questions, common challenges, and a common answer.
Sorry. So Gopila, you are with us now. So why don't you, you can, I'll give you an option. You can respond to Dr. Hanan's observation that the small and large countries of South Asia took very divergent views. The other one would be to follow on from the general and give an idea what you see now as what the world should look like, or what the world should be doing after the Ukraine war.
I would rather focus on South Asia. That's of more interest, I think, a bigger interest to us. Interestingly, what Dr. Hanan said is, it was a very interesting point that he brought out about the big nations of South Asia. Strangely, very strangely, I think abstaining from, or rather tacitly supporting Russia, and then the smaller states Now, what brought the smaller states to this common stand possibly is because, like we have been saying, of our own vulnerabilities. We realized that, our position, our sovereignty, we cannot take our own sovereignty for granted. We need to be very cautious as to how we conduct our foreign policy, as to how we position ourselves, not just in South Asia, but also with bigger nation states outside of South Asia. Also, the vulnerability of dependency, especially for us as a mountainous, landlocked country, our almost absolute dependency on India, for example, has always been a question of, question of existence for us. And is there, the bigger question for me would be, is there, can there be a common consensus among South Asian countries when it comes to issues, big issues like war outside of South Asia? Because as you look at it, I think every nation state's reaction is driven by their own interests. Bangladesh, obviously, the Russians are building their first nuclear reactor in Rupur. And also Maldives, obviously, Sri Lanka, heavily dependent on Russian tourists. Of course, Sri Lanka is a different case study right now because of its own, internal turmoil right now. Then you have Afghanistan is a different case study because of what's happened there. There you have Taliban in control of, the internal government, and you have a government in exile. Then you have Pakistan, obviously, has always been more pro-Russia, pro-China. So Pakistan, it wasn't a surprise because it was a very clear case of where they would lean towards. India, obviously, because of its long-standing military ties with Russia, we were not surprised that India chose to remain silent. And obviously, it possibly, India also, what the message we got was that it put its economic and military ties with Russia in front of its sympathy with smaller state that was being invaded by its big friend. So I don't really see a possibility of South Asian countries, even with the existence of SAARC, making a common stand on these big international issues. SAARC has never been more a courageous body, right from its start in 1986. I think it has been a very weak link of, 8 South Asian countries that often disagreed more than agreed on issues, a lot of inaction and a lot of infighting. So I don't really see SAARC. Maybe if we, if there's a renewed political will from bigger South Asian countries to strengthen or revisit SAARC and make it a stronger, body. Otherwise, I don't really see that South Asia will have a common voice on these issues. So at the end, I think South Asia, as fractured as it is, despite being one of the poorest part of the world, despite being, one of the most vulnerable parts of the world, I think we will continue to remain divided, I guess, in the way we look at geopolitics outside our region.
So Dr. Hanan, let's turn to some of the questions that have been raised on the chat site. And a number of them, so I sort of put them to this one group together, which talks about what is the future of the world going to be like after, what is the global consequence of the Ukraine war in terms of, do you see this as a sign of another Cold War era now descending on the international system? Assuming that this war comes to an end at some point, what are we going to need? What does the world need to be doing? Should it be looking at things like recovery and rehabilitation, reconstruction, particularly of the Ukraine? And what do you think are the prospects of a Ukraine-Russia negotiated settlement at some point?
This is a very difficult question because we don't know what would happen. and there is a huge element of unpredictability in this case, especially regarding Putin. And nobody knows what Putin will decide to do. As you know, in the beginning of the war, there was uncertainty whether Russia will resort to the use of nuclear weapons, because they gave indications they might. In the beginning, you know, Putin mobilized their nuclear forces on standby. And there were remarks by some Russian officials, including his spokesperson, that if Russian sovereignty was in threat, then they will use nuclear weapons. But later on, there were remarks by the foreign ministry that they will not use nuclear weapons. And when we are at the 4th month of the invasion, now we have clear indications from Russia that they will not use nuclear weapons, and that they are more responsible than that. But still, you know, in the beginning, the reaction of some countries, their stand regarding the invasion, I think, was partly because of this uncertainty about Russian use of nuclear weapons or mass destruction, because we know their nuclear weapons can reach any point in the world. So all the countries can be threatened by Russia. So I think some countries, they contemplated about this threat as well, and they were hesitant to immediately condemn Russia. On the other hand, many countries, they understood and they acted in the interest of their economy, because they know the world economy is controlled not by China or Russia. At least the current economic system in the world is controlled by Western countries. So these countries were very careful to not provoke EU and USA and Western countries more than Russia. So I think that explains the reason behind these positions of these countries, including our countries like Nepal, Bhutan, and Nepal. So we are very careful about not to provoke EU. EU is a strong economic powerhouse in the world. We do not want them to be too anger. Especially, you know, we know, though some say Western countries didn't do enough in the beginning, but I think Western countries, including NATO and other European countries, and including Canada and USA, they have been very careful to defend Ukraine from Russian invasion, and also they have been very careful not to provoke Russia to the extent of their use, to the extent that they will resort to the use of nuclear weapons. This is the reason that they didn't take all the necessary measures to contain Russia, including sending troops to Ukraine. They didn't do it not because they are supporting Russia's actions, but they are very careful not to help start of a third world war and the use of nuclear weapons, because we know if a nuclear weapons is used, all other countries also will be forced to use it, and we all will be doomed. All will be doomed, and we will be under a nuclear winter. So these countries have been thinking about this as well. That doesn't mean they are not supporting Ukraine. They are supporting Ukraine, and the future result after this conflict is very difficult to predict. And whether Russia and Ukraine will negotiate is also very difficult to predict. But I don't think a way out except negotiation, because Russia is hell-bent to invade Ukraine and prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. So they are doing whatever they can to prevent that, and therefore, and then they are a big country, they have weapons. So even without all these economic sanctions, they are still maintaining their military force. So negotiation is the key to end this conflict. But what we see is when a country is in a strong position in this war, they are not giving way for negotiations. Like now we see Russia is succeeding in creating this land corridor between Eastern Europe and Crimea. So they have almost succeeded that. So in that sense, so they largely failed it seems the initial intention was to invade and overthrow the government in Kiev, but they failed that largely, totally. They failed that initial, target. But their original target, we all know, was this creating this land border. So they succeeded that, and therefore you can argue they are in a strong position. So it is very hard for them to give up their originally announced, conditions about mostly false accusations against Ukraine. Similarly, Ukraine succeeded,
Okay, we seem to have lost Dr. Anand. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so we're coming close to a close now. So let me just have there are a couple of more questions which I'll look at. One question seems is aimed at me in the sense it's about India. Basically, India, if Ukraine, okay, so this is a person, Jean-Marie, who wants to say that if the Ukraine war is seen as a battle between dictatorship and democracy, India being the world's largest democracy, why did it take the position that they did? My response would be actually that while India is a democracy, it actually has never portrayed itself as a leader in global democracy. India does not support, has never supported the promotion of democracy in other countries, and has in fact often been quite critical of the United States in particular for trying to go around invading other countries and so on and promoting democracy. There was never, for example, a school in India that argued that China would ever be a democratic nation because of its economic growth, and they found that position to be rather bizarre when they faced it in China, in the West. So for India, it's really fundamentally their foreign policy is based on very hard, realpolitik views of their interest, whatever they may be internally as a democracy. And I think it's been very clear in my own conversations with Indian officials that given that their present crisis, their, should we say, continuing border issues with China, and given their dependence on Russian weapons, they were in no position to really cut off what they saw as their primary military supply chain from Russia. The Ukraine war was, they did see it as a mistake by Russia, but they did not see it as something that they needed to worry about or take a position on the basis of democracy. They took it solely on the basis of their interests. There's a question about the food security situation. I think some of you have addressed that in the sense that we do have, all of us have experienced food inflation. Do any of you want to add anything to that about what should be done or could be done about food security or even energy security, given what's happening in the Ukraine? Somebody mentioned about SAARC playing a greater role, but I think the last time SAARC even held a summit was, if I remember correctly, 2014 in Kathmandu. And given the, should we say, dissension between India and Pakistan, India at least is not invested in SAARC anymore. But perhaps anybody else has some ideas about food and energy security. Dr. Hunan.
Well, can I? Okay.
Sorry. Dr. Hanan, go ahead, but just make it brief, and then I'll turn to General Basnian.
Yes. The food security is a big issue when we think of this issue, because we know, because as you know, Ukraine and Russia, they are like breadbasket for the globe in terms of providing for food. But in this case, we are fortunate because we are in the neighborhood of India. India itself is a major exporter of major food items. When we talk about Maldives, I think Maldives has been exempt from many of the Indian export embargoes of items like wheat. So that is good for us. So probably, you know, even in future, when we talk about food security, India can play a big role in that, I think.
General, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I mean, like 3 months into the war now, I mean, I don't think either side will be really able to achieve their own intentions, whether UK will not be able to drive the Russian forces, nor will Russia be able to fulfill its aim of political control over Ukraine. So what this derives to is the question of the war is going to be prolonged. The other issues, the rise of prices, commodity short supplies. So I think there is a need. That's why I brought up this. It's an opportunity, but it's also an opportunity for the South Asian peoples to come out with solutions. Like when you talk about one of these reliance on oil and fuel. So this is now, how do we improve our energy security? So US also has constantly been in war. So they uphold the US energy policy for national security. And the other one is the food security. So a greener economy is the desire. So how do you actually go planning into that? Because in South Asians, we are the least connected regions in the world. So how do we start developing our connectivity so that our common resources are being used for the region first before it goes out of our regional borders? And finally, I mean, as I have been bringing out so much, that Nepal is a landlocked country. So landlocked countries need to secure the line of supply from the oceans to the foothills of the mountains, you know. So, I mean, that's why it is a time that we as a region sit down. Like Prime Minister Modi did bring out a financial package when the pandemic started, but which didn't materialize at all. But now it is another moment for the larger nations to contribute through regional organizations on how can we address the shortages that we are facing today. And the prolonged war is going to increase more. So before political chaos starts happening in our regions, because of the economy and food shortages. Thank you.
Thank you. Gopal, I'll leave you with the last word. There any question that you see that you would like to answer? I noticed one from Bangladesh, a country unfortunately missing in our panel today, about asking that if the US, to eliminate threats against itself, could invade Iraq and Afghanistan, why should Russia be judged differently? That's a possible question if you wish to respond to that. Otherwise, please go ahead and make your closing comment.
I think I would rather say, our concerns here. The local concerns in Bhutan today is the inflation as well as a major problem. in terms of energy security, you know that Bhutan produces a huge surplus energy, hydropower energy that we export to India. But ironically, we also import, a huge amount of petroleum products, fossil fuel from India, especially for our surface transport. So the, increase in fuel prices will have direct impact on the lives of Bhutanese people. That's been a major worry here, more than the food security. I think energy security in terms of, import of petroleum products, fuel is a big concern, but also an opportunity for Bhutan to explore how we can actually use the energy that is locally available, hydropower, to, probably bring about a revolution in terms of our, change the transport system. So that is where we are as a country. Our major worry today is on fuel.
Thank you. So I'll just mention my closing comments will be that only to say that we are now, Dr. Hanan has exposed the division in South Asia. We should call it the Hanan divide after him, between the principled views of the small South Asian countries versus the interest-driven views of the larger ones. And presumably this is something that is a global phenomenon. We'll see whether the Hanan divide is global. And just mention, I think that somebody had mentioned, somebody had asked, why should Russia be judged differently given the fact that other great powers do carry out aggressive wars? And that's a valid point. The real issue, I think, one is, did the Ukraine really do anything that endangered Russia? I think that's highly questionable. And second, just because other countries do something wrong doesn't really make another wrong, therefore correct. But let me end there and let me turn it over. I think Dr. Klein, you may have some closing comments.
Yes, thank you very, very much to all of you from Friedrich-Naumann Foundation here in South Asia. It was really a very relevant and good discussion. So thank you very much, especially for all your clear statements and comments. We, as Foundation, appreciate this open exchange about different personal and also national positions and interests. And of course, we are going to promote this exchange in different events, and we are definitely going to continue this series on Ukraine, but also on other matters. However, in this particular case, Friedrich-Naumann Foundation and of course many Western nations and individuals as organizations, we all support show our solidarity to the courageous people of the Ukraine who are holding up the torch of freedom and defend, of course, also our universal values for all of the people with their personal lives. So again, dear panelists, dear General Basniat from Nepal, Dr. Hanan from the Maldives, Mr. Ajaya from Bhutan, and of course not to forget Mr. Pal Chaudhry from India, and Mr. Faber from Germany and the German Bundestag. Thanks to you all being our distinguished guests. And again, thanks for your really very valuable comments. I would not like to forget also to mention here the colleagues in Germany who enabled us to do this event, Mr. Schmierer, Mr. Meffert from Bavaria, and the German part of the foundation, Mr. Budrich. Thank you very much for your technical support from Universum. And of course, thanks to our dear team members, especially Nupur Hasija, Manjari Mishra, and Mr. Paljor for always being the moderator and the motor for these events. Thank you also for the Deutsche Nepal Gesellschaft and the Deutsche Bhutan Himalaya Gesellschaft for your continuous support. I would like and suggest if you would like to know about our work and the next events we are planning, check on social media channels. Especially, I would like to draw your attention to the 7th of June, where we have a seminar, a webinar on Bhutan and different political and social questions in that extremely interesting country. So thank you very much to all of you. Do have a very, very nice day. Thanks again to our panelists. We hope that we stay in touch, and we will definitely reach out to you once we are in your countries and try to meet you there in person. Thanks, all the best wishes. Bye from Delhi.